Hello, Bree. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the quadratic formula and complex solutions. So you've got an equation here that's a quadratic, and normally the easiest way to solve a quadratic equation would be to factor it, except for in this case, it's not factorable. So what we do is we use the quadratic formula to help us solve for the zeros. In this case, the a is the number in front of the x squared, so a is equal to 3. The b is the number in front of the x, so b is equal to 5. And the constant term is c, which is 4. And we use this equation, which I've got written over here, in the case where you have a x squared plus bx plus c equals 0, then x can be found by taking negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. So it's just a matter of plugging in those numbers. So x will equal negative 5 plus or minus the square root of b squared, and I'm going to take a little shortcut here. 5 squared is 25, minus 4 times a. 4 times a would be 12, and times c would be another 4 times 12, would be 48. Divided by 2 times a, which is 2 times 3 is 6. And now it's just, you can see here that what's going to happen is I'm going to get a square root that's negative, a negative number underneath the square root. And that's not a real number. There are no real numbers that multiply by themselves to get a negative. So this is what's called an imaginary number. And what we do is we treat it as if we break it apart into its real and its imaginary portions. So we're going to I'll go ahead and do the math here. 25 minus 48 is negative 23. So our answer is right there. And then what we can do is we can break this apart into a square root of negative 1 times the square root of 23. So negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 23 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of negative 1 has a name in math, and it's called I. So I, the imaginary number I. And so what we do is we just replace it with the letter I. So we have negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 23I divided by 6. And essentially that's the answer. Now you can break it apart into its two pieces. You can call it x equals negative 5 plus the square root of 23I over 6, and negative 5 minus the square root of 23I over 6. You always want to make sure that you check the radical to make sure that it can't be reduced anymore. If it has in it a perfect square, you can take the perfect square out of the radical. That's a subject for a different lesson. You can also break this apart into its two pieces here. You can take the fraction and break it apart into the two numerators. So I could call this negative 5 over 6 plus the square root of 23 over 6I. And that's kind of the proper format for a complex number. A complex number is one that has a real number part and an imaginary number part. You take the real number plus the imaginary portion. And then same thing with the other one, negative 5 over 6 minus the square root of 23 over 6 times I. Hopefully that was useful to you.